Well, welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you here for this conversation this evening. My name is Lindsay King. I work at Deep Vellum, which is a nonprofit independent publisher located here in Dallas. And thanks to all you guys coming from sort of both coasts, we're really happy to have a big virtual event here from all around the country. If you're new to Deep Vellum, we're really happy to have you here especially. Deep Vellum, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit independent publisher. We publish a range of really awesome books and do a variety of programming as well. We've been having virtual events now for the past couple of months, and it's been wonderful to stretch our wings and meet new people from around the country who wouldn't necessarily be able to come on site to see us. If you'd like to know more about Deep Vellum, I'm going to put our website in the chat box and also in the comments on Facebook. So feel free to check out our website, look at our books, and visit our events page. I'll put a link to the events page in particular too. Tonight, we are really happy to be hosting the second iteration of our virtual event series called Accessibility in the Literary Arts. Tonight's event features 4 incredible writers and activists who will talk about BIPOC and disability inclusion in the literary arts. And as I mentioned, we have one panelist who should be coming in a minute. So we have 3 panelists for now, hopefully 4 on the way. So just before we can get into this event, a couple of things. We do have some really great events coming up in the month of October. We're working with some literary festivals and some independent bookstores around the US to do some great virtual events. So I'll put our event calendar in the chat box, and I hope to see you guys there. We would really, really love to have you there. The next reminder is that tonight is a pay what you can event. All the proceeds from tonight will go directly to supporting the writers on this panel. So they won't actually go to Deep Vellum, we'll give it right back to the writers in this panel. And I'll also drop the donation link in the comments as well if you'd like to give a contribution. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our 4 panelists. Let me confirm really quickly. Oh, you know what? Our 4th panelist asked me for a link, so I'm going to send him a link if you guys will bear with me very quickly. Give me just one moment, and I will re-invite him to the event, and then we'll do introductions. All right, so he'll be joining us here in just a moment. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll go right into conversation. I think the way this will work is we'll do a period of kind of more formal panel questions and conversation, and then we'll leave some time at the end for audience questions. So if you guys have questions, comments, thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat box on Zoom or on Facebook. And then we'll get to the end and I'll read the questions and we'll hopefully be able to answer as many questions as you have. You know, feel free to do that as we talk or at the end if questions come to you. So let me do some quick introductions. Our first panelist tonight is Wendy Lu, who is a news editor and disability reporter based in New York City. She currently works for the HuffPost, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Columbia Journalism Review, and many other publications. She writes on a wide range of health and social issues within the disability community, including topics like education, family, relationships, and policy. And she also writes creative fiction. Alex Montoya, who will be joining us in just a few minutes, is a writer and inspirational speaker based in San Diego. He is the author of 8 books, including Living Inspired, a book he wrote in the wake of his father's death, and most recently, a children's book called Alex Masters the Monkey Bars, which I hope we'll get to talk with him about a bit. He is the founder of Motivational Communications, where he provides presentations for organizations and companies across the United States, addressing his own experiences as a first-generation immigrant, disabled person, and writer. Next, we have Leroy Moore, who is an activist, writer, poet, rapper, feminist, and radio programmer. Lots of things. He is the founder of the Krip-Hop Nation, which is a movement that addresses ableism or discrimination against disabled artists, and the author of Black Disabled Art History 101 and Black Cripple Delivers Poetry and Lyrics. He is also a co-founder of Sin's Invalid, a disability justice-based performance project, and a columnist at Forward magazine. And finally, we have Val Vera, who is a poet, journalist, and disability justice activist based in Denton, just up the highway from us here at Deep Vellum. He's the founder of the Disability Inclusion Society. He's the chair of the Committee on Persons with Disabilities at the City of Denton, and the director of inclusion at Alpha Psi Lambda. He is highly involved in local politics and activism, and his poetry deals with these themes. So I'm going to put some various links to Deep Vellum, to the donation site, but also to the places that you can follow these writers and find their work online. I'm going to put those into the chat right now, and we'll jump right into questions. And I see perfect timing. Alex is here, so we'll update him on where we are while I put these things into the chat. All right. Alex, are you with us?
I'm here.
Perfect. You came at an excellent time. I just did some short introductions, and I was just about to launch into some questions. So if you're ready to go, we are.
I'm ready. My apologies for logging in late.
No problem at all. You're on the West Coast, so I know this is a funny time for you. I actually just wanted to start with a really broad question. I did some brief introductions, but I'm wondering if you could each tell us a little bit about your writing, where you live in the US. Just tell us a little bit more about yourselves, and I'll kind of point to you in the order that you appear on my screen. Val, would you mind telling us a little bit more about you first?
Sure. Most of my writing, I do poetry. So my poetry really focuses on my identity as a disabled person, or as a Crip, as I unapologetically identify myself with. So it's a lot of poetry and activism, justice, but also poetry on sex as a disabled person, love, just life as a disabled Latin person. That's mainly where my poetry focuses on. I've done freelance journalism, more recently the last couple of years with Latino Rebels, which has, I really enjoy it because it's mainly a non-disabled audience that reads that, so I get to sort of educate and amplify voices of disabled Latinx across the country and introduce people that normally wouldn't even consider or know that, part of disability culture, there are disabled Latinx artists and models and activists and writers. So that's pretty much my writing background. I'm based here in Denton, Texas, just north of Dallas. I'm originally from Chicago and a graduate of Purdue University. Lived around the country a little bit. Before Texas, I lived in San Diego. Alex and I are pretty good friends, and I'm sure he's watching the baseball game over there. That's why probably why he's late. So, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wendy, you're next on my screen.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy, pronoun she, her. I am based in New York. For right now, I'm in North Carolina helping my my sister and just my parents taking care of my nephew. So I'm an editor at Oaks, been there for a couple years. So I both edit and write, report on the intersection of disability, politics, and culture, as well as a lot of issues pertaining to the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Most recently, I helped spearhead our package at HuffPost on the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was just like a whole series of a bunch of stories about the ADA, both celebrating the progress that we've made in the last 30 years, as well as just how much further we have to go. I also do a lot of freelance journalism as well. So recently I wrote a piece for the New York Times about companies that have this hiring strategy where they only hire people with disabilities, and how that initially sounds like, why is that not a good thing if we're hiring disabled people? But the story was about how a lot of times certain people with certain disabilities get boxed into particular industries. So taking a closer look at that and what equity truly means in the workplace. And outside of my journalism, I do write a lot of middle grade fiction. So that's fiction for kids ages 9 through 12. And that's just a really nice way for me to get out of the journalism bubble and focus on just like being creative, making stuff up. And a lot of my characters are, they have like, they reflect my own identities as well. So.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Leroy. Think you are still, there you go.
Hello. Hello. I want to first take a minute to honor the indigenous people's lands that we're on, and I want to also honor my Black disabled ancestors. So yeah. So I'm Leroy Moore. I live in Berkeley, California. I've been an activist since I was born. I had no choice in the matter. My parents were activists, so I'm an activist. I see my disability as my identity, as my culture, not only in America, but internationally. I wrote like 5 books. The recent one is Black Disabled Ancestors, short stories. And I am also an activist around police brutality, been an activist since the 1980s. And I'm also an uncle, love my nephews, my nieces. And also a part of many organizations like Poor Magazine, the National Black Disability Coalition, and I started what's called Krip-Hop Nation. Thanks for having me.
I'm starting to wonder when you guys actually sleep. But thank you so much. Alex, you are last on my screen.
Sleep is overrated, Lindsay. I tell you. Well, first of all, thank you again. Such a blessing to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I am in San Diego, California, where I met the brilliant Val Vera, about close to 25 years ago, if you can believe that. I consider Val to be one of my closest friends in the world. You know, even though we're states apart, he's still my brother in my heart. So thrilled to be on this panel with him in particular. And for me, very similar to Val, writing has always been a very personal medium. I tend to write more of an autobiographical style and more autobiographical narrative. It has a bit of a dual purpose in the sense that I always want to motivate people to show that the lessons that I've learned in overcoming disability can help them in overcoming any challenges at all. So whether they have a disability, a visible disability, or not, I want them to see that. But as the years have gone on, I've also taken on, I feel, more of an activist role, because ableism is so prevalent in our world, and with the fact that things like the ADA are not respected 30 years later, we have no choice but to be activists and to take on, I think, a little bit more of a defiant tone, and show people that, we need to be strong-willed about what our reality is like. So I have written 5 books myself. I'm a writer by trade. That's always been my first love. And I own my own motivational communications company. So I help other people write books as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for telling us a little bit more about what you do. I'd like to jump into some content questions here. Val, I'm going to turn to you for this question, but I really want to hear from all of you. Just Val and I had a conversation about this. You and I have talked about disability culture and the ways that you found meaning and been a leader in that community. Could you talk about how disability culture shapes your writing?
I think for me, I mean, it's all in my writing. I mean, it's how I identify, and I think I actually had to make an intentional effort to also include my racial background, my being Latinx, being Puerto Rican, being brown. Disability culture. I think as a disabled person, it's as soon as you wake up, it's there. It's everything that you do. It's everything that you are. So I really evolved to embrace it and to use it in a way of just identification and learning myself. I mean, like every other culture, there are artists with disabilities, there are models with disabilities, there are, business owners, activists, and, more so there are a lot of disabled BIPOC that are less represented and less amplified than need to be. So I think as a disabled and brown individual, I really try to focus my writing on those two identities and that intersection.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that?
What was the last question, Lindsay?
I was wondering if any of the other panelists wanted to weigh in on that, the way that disability culture shapes your writing.
Yeah, I will, if you don't mind. Disability culture definitely shapes your writing because it really shows your daily existence. Like Val, I'm also Latino. I was born in Medellin, Colombia. Moved to the U.S. when I was 4, and I'm a triple amputee. I had a birth defect that led me to be born missing both my arms and my right leg from birth. But more than anything, my disability really defines my identity because it defines my mindset, my challenges, how people look at me, how people react, and it's very interesting how in today's world, I mean, you could be an extremely successful person by the world's standards, but people are always going to look at your disability first. I think that's just a reality, and so you can look at that 2 ways. You can either be intimidated by it, or you can be proud of it, and you can determine that you're going to be the one that controls the narrative of who you are and where you're going in life. And disability culture ends up, really impacting all of your thoughts and all of your style. So it impacts your writing 100%.
Thank you. The next question I had, and Val, you already touched on this, but I'm wondering how BIPOC and disability identities intersect in your work, and how that plays a role in your writing, how that informs your writing, and in your broader activism. And I'm curious to hear from all of you. I don't know, Wendy, maybe you'd like to start with that question?
Sure. So So for my disability, for example, I have a trach tube due to bilateral vocal cord paralysis, and I'm also Chinese American. So I feel like there's so many ways that I want to answer this question, but I think oftentimes, especially in the newsroom, which is where I work out the post, and I've worked in a lot of spaces where I'm usually one of the only disabled people of color. So that's always challenging because it's like I want to speak up about evolving language around talking about disability. I want to talk about people of color and how there needs to be more people at the table making decisions. So there are just so many ways in which, like, both for me in every space that I am, but also in my work where it shows up. For me, like with my specific identities for disability and race, for example, I wrote a piece last year about what it's like being disabled and Asian in America. And so that was a chance for me to actually talk to a lot of other disabled Asian Americans about so many things that pertain to like what it's like to have those intersect in our everyday lives. Just like, for example, just the pressure to conform to Western values and lifestyles and standards of success can be really hard on my communities. And just like, I feel like people with disabilities already experience a lot of internalized pressure to belong or to prove that we are hard workers and exist. But there's like this double bind where we, if we speak up and talk about accommodations that we need, I always worry that I'm viewed as, oh, disabled people are weak, or, oh, they do need a lot of assistance, which is very infuriating. But then at the same time, there's also this feeling of me needing to push myself because, but at the same time, if I push myself and don't say anything, non-disabled people think, oh, is she really disabled? And so I find that this kind of intersects a lot with like Asian immigrants, not just Asian immigrants, but again, speaking from my experience and like my family, just this pressure to feel like we deserve to be in that space, deserve to belong, and that we are it comes up for me. Those are just a couple of ways come to mind.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry if there was a brief lag. My internet seemed to have cut for a second, but I think I'm back. Thank you. Yeah. Other thoughts on this question? How those identities intersect for you all?
For me, every issue has a disability angle. So it's not only about my disability, but everything I do is about disability issues. The last night vice presidential election, it's about disability issues. So I don't really like separate it. It's a part of everything I do. It's part of my activism. It's part of my worldview. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. That's really fascinating. Any other thoughts on this point?
I just want to chime in. I think also people need to realize that disability is not always visible. So, oftentimes people hear or see disability and they automatically think it's a wheelchair or something that they can see. But there are a lot of disabilities that are not visible. So when we talk about intersectionality and, being Latinx, you can talk about, you know, immigration and detention centers and people that, you know, live with mental health issues, or people that live with other non-visible disabilities, like what their experiences are. I mean, though, and like Leroy said, I mean, every issue has a disability angle. I mean, the disability community makes up 25% of the country. So at some point, you may know of or know someone that knows someone with a disability. So it's, you know, I'll just echoing Leroy's point that, you know, just about everything is disability related.
That's an astounding number. Thank you guys so much for these comments. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. You know, it's interesting, the really the whole duality with um, being a person with a disability and the immigration perspective. Um, there's really a similarity too, in the sense that when you are an immigrant to this country, um, you try to become a part of this country, and you become a part of the traditions while maintaining your heritage as well. And when you are a person with a disability, you try to operate within the functions of the non-disabled world, while um, accepting the realities of whatever your disability is. And the disability culture really kind of helps to ensure that you're not ashamed of what those considerations are. You're not ashamed to ask for reasonable accommodation, or to simply say, this is what I face every day. But it's, for me, I have found that there really is overlap in both of those, because um, you always are feeling like you are entering someone else's world and trying to prove like you belong in that world, and try to make yourself valuable in that world, and try to make sure that people value you. So again, whether it's the immigration perspective or the disability perspective, it's always a duality of wanting to fit in to that world, and but only for the sake of having them accept you for who you are, and really being in a constant state of making sure that they accept you and treat you, right, for the person that you are.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you guys talk about the kind of external pressure versus internal process of thought, and even Leroy's point that the identities aren't really separate for him, that it's kind of internally all him. And I think that's really interesting to hear you all talk about the difference between the outside and the inside. Really fascinating. So I wanted to ask you guys some specific questions about your writing work. And I wonder if, Leroy, I could turn to you first. As you've said, your writing career spans multiple genres, from nonfiction to music, and many things in between. I'm especially interested in your work at Poor Magazine, which, and I, from the website, it's a poor people led / indigenous people led grassroots nonprofit arts organization dedicated to providing revolutionary media access, art, education, and advocacy. I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about your work there.
Yeah, I started at Poor Magazine back in the mid-90s. Once I moved to California from New York, I was always a writer, but I was also an activist. So much of my writings is definitely not mainstream newspaper writing. Perform, and they just reach out to me. It's like, oh, what would you like to write a column for Poor Magazine? I was like, yeah, sure. It was the first column online that dealt with race and disability. And my first article was the shooting of Margaret L. Mitchell, a Black woman with mental health disabilities, back in 98, 97. So way before Black Lives Matter. So that was my first article. And I've been there ever since. You know, Poor Magazine has grown so much, and now they, you know, they do so much. They're building houses. They have their own school. They have their own radio station, which I have a radio show on. And I still do my columns. I do a Krip-Hop column, and yeah, and they also have a small press for poor authors, because another group of authors and writers that never get any respect is poor, you know, writers. So with Poor Magazine Press, I published my first book that came out in 1998. It was entitled Black Disabled Man with a Big Mouth and a High IQ. So that was the first book, and now my recent book on Black disabled authors, Black disabled ancestors. Well, Poor Magazine does so much, you know, activism, journalism, everything.
That's really incredible. I wonder if you could also tell us just a bit about Krip-Hop Nation.
Yeah, Krip-Hop Nation started like 13 years ago. Myself, Keith Jones, and the late Rod the Noise Temple. And we started because we didn't see ourselves in hip hop. So we wanted to start an activist kind of network where disabled hip hop artists and other musicians can come in, you know, do a song or do a project, you know, also do education and advocacy, because Krip-Hop is about education and advocacy. And yeah, so it's been 13 years, and we've been to South Africa, Germany, Canada, UK. We just did the theme song for the Paralympics that was on Netflix, a show called Phoenix Rising. And so we did the theme song for that. And yeah, it's been going good. We had chapters all over.
Thank you so much. Those are really incredible projects. Looking forward to finding out more too. Wendy, I wonder if I can ask you a question about your work. You've talked about your work as a journalist, and you mentioned that you also recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which I imagine brought a whole new level of attention to your writing. On your blog and elsewhere, you've also talked about what changed for you as your platform grew and you gained readers very quickly. I'm wondering if you could tell us what that experience has been like, and how your writing practices and your thoughts about journalism have changed as you've entered the public spotlight in a very public way.
Yeah, I guess like my first thought to that is I feel like I'm still very much learning myself. There's so much about disability culture that's that I understand because of activists who have come before me and who have been in this for so long. And so like with my work, I feel like if there's just one person who reads my pieces and takes something away from it that they feel like is insightful, just one person, that alone makes it worth it for me. I think it also makes me feel more of a sense of responsibility in a way where, you know, sometimes I get messages from people who do say the kindest things about like how they read this piece of mine and how it really resonates with them. And it keeps me fired up, keeps me motivated to keep doing what I'm doing. Which, especially when like I'm often the only disabled person in any newsroom, it can get discouraging sometimes because I'm often the one who brings up the fact that, hey, we need to write more about disability, and we need to talk about it in a way that's like not problematic anymore. I'm often the one pushing a lot of those initiatives pretty much anywhere I go, really. So getting messages like that really reminds me that I feel like I'm doing the right thing and I need to keep doing it. I think it's also taught me to take care of myself better because with all of the kind messages I get, I also get trolled sometimes, and that can be really challenging. Most of the time, they don't bother me, but there are instances where like I'm thinking about, there was I came across this forum where these like trolls were just bashing me, saying that I was using my disability to like, I remember they said, look at this person just parading her disability. Like they made it as if I was kind of using it to get attention for myself. And I remember that really upset me because for me, like, this is so much bigger than just me. This is about an entire community of people that's been marginalized for so long, for hundreds of years, since the beginning of time. So this is so much more than just about me. So I think like if I get people who make fun of, I don't know, something really superficial about me, I really don't care and kind of laugh it off. But if it's about like my intentions or my motivations for why I do things, that can be really hard. And I always try to remind myself that like, you know, these people don't know me, and that like I have to take care of myself. I remember I also got like super trolled on Twitter for writing a piece, writing a piece about like how Trump had turned the coronavirus into this like super, like he was using racist terms about it against the Chinese community. And I wrote and tweeted about it and got a lot of hate for that. And I remember like oftentimes there's this struggle where I feel like maybe I shouldn't talk about that or share that side of being a journalist because, you know, I have to stay positive. But then I'm like, no, like this is a reality that's part of it. So I remember I decided to like share that thread where everybody was saying really horrible things and kind of trying not to gaslight myself into thinking that this kind of thing doesn't exist or doesn't matter, because it is. So I guess like kind of to sum that up, in many ways it's so helpful, and I'm really humbled by like anybody who ever reads my pieces takes something away from it. And at the same time, it can be really challenging as well. So it's very nuanced.
Yeah, that sounds like a constant game of back and forth, you know, dealing with the level of responsibility. Yeah, that's really interesting. Val, I want to turn to you for a minute. As you have mentioned, you founded the Disability Inclusion Society. I'm really curious just to hear why poetry? What is it that draws you to poetry, and how do you use the poetry within your activism?
Why poetry? That's a good question. I think for me, poetry just provides a snapshot of a topic or an experience or, you know, part of an identity, but in a rhythmic way, you know, in a creative way. And I think that's what draws me to poetry. I mean, it's just, you know, it gives me a license to express realities, but in a very sometimes ambiguous or metaphoric kind of way. Kind of fits my personality. Um, so I think that's why the poetry. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
I'm curious how you use that poetry within your activism.
Yeah, I think just the words in the poems. I mean, I think anybody who's read any of my poetry, you know, I speak about, you know, racial injustice from the disability point of view. I speak about ableism from the disability point of view. Um, you know, so it's my voice on paper that can probably be identified or where others can probably identify in the same way. You know, activism, especially for people with significant disabilities, activism isn't always marching in the streets or attending council meetings or, you know, being physically present. Activism can be in writing. It can be in blogging. It can be in just your Twitter account. I mean, there's social media activism. And I think what the non-disabled world is finding out because of the pandemic is that all these things have always been available. You know, it's, you know, being able to work from home is now commonplace because it affects non-disabled people. You know, where disabled people have been fighting for this for years and have been told, oh, no, we just can't do that. Well, now it's commonplace, you know, where council meetings and political meetings are held virtually, where food is delivered to your door. I mean, these things, because it affects everybody, all of a sudden became available. So I think activism for myself and maybe a lot of other disabled people is almost bittersweet. I mean, it's, yeah, like, wow, look at all these things that are happening now, but it really wasn't because we demanded it or it benefited us. It's because you know, it impacts the population as a whole.
It's really interesting. I find it also inspiring to hear how you think of words as activism. Just working for a publisher, we work with a lot of writers for whom that is their primary form of speaking out. So that's really interesting to hear you say that. And finally, Alex, I'd like to ask you about your writing. You, as you mentioned, published a lot of autobiographical work, including a book about your experience coming to the US, a young immigrant from Colombia. What's it like to talk about yourself for an audience of readers? And how do you decide where to draw the line, what to talk about publicly and what to keep private?
You know, I mean, writing in general, I'm sure our entire panel will agree, is very personal, and you are exposing your deepest soul when you're writing. Um, you know, for me, I mean, I knew that I was a writer ever since I was 10 years old. That was going to be just something that I was going to do. Just had to find a way to eventually get paid for it. You know, that was going to be the eventual career goal. But it wasn't until I was 34 years old that I published my first book. I'm 46 now, so that was 12 years ago. So on the one hand, writing my first book, which was always a lifelong goal, and talking about my journey as both an immigrant and as somebody with a disability, really was so well received that it led to my second book, kind of snowballed from there. But I also saw that people have a very natural tendency to pat you on the back and just say, "Oh, you're so inspiring. You're doing, you know, you're doing so incredibly, and you inspire me. And I think there's value in that. I think if we, as people with disabilities, inspire people to do greater in their life, I think there is a positive to that. But I also think there's the potential for them to be very dismissive and to, number one, um, not think about all of the struggles that we have to go through just to get through life every day. And so I wanted to really continue to communicate that, but also to amplify the fact that there is ableism in the world, and the fact that um, 30 years later, the ADA is not being adhered to, is not being respected. And so I really, and it's an ongoing process. I'd be lying to you if I said that I've found the formula. It's an ongoing process to be able to find a way that explains my story, explains my perspective, but also, talks about ableism and disability culture and all of the things that we face in this world. Wendy mentioned President Trump, and even within my writing, whether it was my autobiographical books or more day to day like blogs or social media posts, it was quite amazing when, for me, it was a deal breaker that then candidate Trump mocked somebody with a disability. But it was incredible that the reaction was, by and large, it's not so bad, it's not so funny, it's not so harmful. He was just, trying to be funny. More than anything, he was just talking about how bad the media is. And to me, that really showed that the minimization of the disability community was very much alive at that point. And then when you look at things like the kids that are in the cages at the border, I knew immediately as soon as I heard that story, and as soon as I heard about families being torn apart by deportation, I just knew that I knew that there were going to be families impacted by disability, impacted by those decisions. And so it really has led me to say, who's speaking up for us? Who is stopping to talk about the impact this is having on kids with disabilities and families with disabilities? And so that really transformed your writing. And so in essence, you kind of begin writing about yourself, but you begin kind of writing about the greater scope of the disability community.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have one more question for you guys, and then if there are any questions from folks who are listening, feel free to drop those in the chat, and I'll read those aloud. But before we get there, I'm really curious to hear what changes you've seen in the BIPOC disabled community of writers over the course of your career. Have you seen changes within that community? I don't know who wants to take that first. Anyone?
Okay, I'll take that one. I don't know if I've seen changes because, again, we're specifically talking about disabled BIPOC, and even within the disability community, there's racism. The disability rights movement was predominantly a white movement. So, disabled BIPOC and disabled Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color, and having our voices amplified and heard and written about is, has been silenced for a long time. And I often say that, the disability community is pretty reflective of what goes on in the general population. So with Black Lives Matter, racial injustices, disabled BIPOC has, pretty much not piggyback, but has had an opportunity to say, disabled Black Lives Matter too, and disabled Indigenous people, have also been, colonized. So there are stories in there. And unfortunately, at least from my experience, there aren't enough of our voices that get published, or there are not enough of our voices that get heard or read. And that, that goes down to, you know, economic situations of not being able to afford to be published. Um, the list goes on why that is. But I look forward to, I mean, you have 4 individuals here who are excellent writers and excellent activists, and I know there are more, and it takes a deep vellum in every community to say, we need to amplify and give platforms to stories like this and individuals with these stories, so that way it can spread.
Thank you. Other thoughts on that question?
Yeah, Lindsay, I think in terms of kind of the evolving of BIPOC writers, um, I think for one, we've begun to realize that, and Val alluded to it, disability is not a one-dimensional thing. So, for example, I have a sibling who has a developmental disability, and I am as passionate about writing about when people use certain words that to them it may just be a joking term. For me, it's a slur because of the fact that my brother has a developmental disability, and so I've kind of been forced to go beyond my horizons and kind of stretch in my activism to go beyond my disability. I think too, just with the internet, social media, and kind of the overall scope of communications, we've seen how much overlap there is. So, Wendy, for example, talking about the adverse effects on the Asian community, and helping illuminate that. Leroy talking about Black Lives Matter. I really believe that there's been more of an overlap where we see all the different communities that all of us belong to, but how it's all one main struggle. I think we realize, I guess, kind of the greater point being that we have a right to make sure that whenever the word diversity is discussed, that we're included, because too often it is not. When people talk about diversity, they think in terms of ethnicity and gender, and sexual orientation and things like that. And disability, too often and historically, is just completely left off the table. And I think because all of us on the panel are ethnically diverse, I think we're probably a little more sensitive to it in the first place. But then we also are able to come and say, well, hey, diversity means a lot of different things, but it should always, always include disability. And so I see where that has become a bigger priority.
Yeah, can I be real? I think if we cut off the internet, we cut off 95% of disability voices. You go into any local bookstore, they don't have a disability section. If they do, it's small as heck, and it's all medical. So, it's funny. I put out 5 books. I haven't been invited to a Black bookstore. And I put out 5 books, all about Black disabled people, and I haven't been invited to a Black bookstore. I've been on the college lecture circuit for 21 years. Haven't been invited to a Black university. I've been on I've been to Harvard, I've been to Yale. I haven't been invited to my own Black university. So I think, yeah, voices are out there, but I'm so glad that Wendy Lu is here, and I'm so glad that you're working at the New York Times because, besides the internet, I see it a little, but I don't see it a lot. And that really scares me, and just wondering if somebody clicks clicked off the internet, where does our voice lay? You know, and publishers, you know, and publishers is like record labels. They're so inaccessible, and they still have like 1970s kind of thinking on disability. I think that's one problem of the disability community, is that we stay so isolated, and we stay amongst our own, that a lot of the industries don't even know that we're here. I do Krip-Hop, and you know, Krip-Hop's been here for 13 years. Krip-Hop's never been on a hip hop panel, never been in a hip hop book, you know, and so it's, you know, it's a catch-22, because, like I said, just wondering if somebody just clicks off the internet, you know, where do we see ourselves? You know, can we go into a bookstore and see a section on disability? You know, can we go into a record? Well, there's no record stores no more. But anyway, you know, can we go into other stores and see ourselves? I think, and I know it's gonna be kind of harsh, but I have to say, I think some of our leaders have been satisfied for a half a pie, and not the whole pie. And we can't be satisfied for a half a pie if we're gonna feed the whole community.
That's such an important point. Really great evisceration, I would say, of a lot of institutions, publishing companies, and bookstores. And I thank you for that comment. So I'm mindful that we're at the end of our time, but we have some audience questions that, for those of you who are still here, we can ask a couple of them before I wrap up. I see we have the ultimate writer's question, which is, how do you deal with writer's block?
By writing every day, for me. I mean, I tell this to all of my writers, disabled and non-disabled. I really feel that, and I'd be curious to see if the panel agrees with me, when it comes to writing, I feel like the two most important steps in the process is, number one, figuring out what is your voice, and number two, who is your audience. And the only way that you know either of those is to write every day or write consistently. And that might be through blogs, that might be through online writing. You know, obviously it's hard to be published every day, you know, unless you're a journalist, and obviously that's your paid profession. But I think, you know, for example, like, you know, with Val, he has seen that poetry, and really the lyricism in poetry is his voice, and that's the best way for him to convey what he wants to convey. I think everyone needs to find out, you know, what their voice is and what their medium is, and then figure out who is the audience you're trying to reach. Is it people with disabilities? Is it non-disabled? Is it both? Is it a particular age group? Are you appealing more as an activist, or more as someone that wants to just simply educate? And I don't think there's any one answer or wrong answer. I think there's a lot of overlap, but I think it's very important to figure out, you know, not only who your voice is, but who your audience is, to decide if what you're communicating is something you're going to continue to communicate, or if you need to adjust it in any kind of way. I think you should always be true to that voice, but I also think as writers, we all have a goal of wanting to make sure that we're heard, and so you need to figure out if you're conveying your message in the right way. So writing every single day, I honestly believe is the best way.
Thank you so much. Another question we have is, how do you know which outlets to publish in, especially with respect to your intersectionalities, excuse me? Where do you publish? How do you know what to choose?
I'd say for me, I mean, I've had articles published in disability-focused outlets and non-disabled focused outlets. And honestly, to me, it's almost easier for me. It's easier to find an outlet that doesn't have that disabled voice and wants it. So for me, being, the last 2 years with Latino Rebels, I mean, they welcome that voice. They welcome that little piece of, diversity that's Latino and also disability. So it's almost relaxing. It's not like, okay, non-disabled people really know nothing about disability, so let me give them something that can give them a glimpse of our community. Whereas writing for an outlet that's disability focused, I think for me, it's more of a challenge. I mean, it's, again, within the big disability culture community, it's, what niche do you fall into? What are you, the unapologetic, bold Crip? Or are you the PC, person with disability? What is your voice on? So it's, for me, I think I tend to look more for the outlet that doesn't really have that disability BIPOC voice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me is that I try to make sure, and sometimes you just can't do it. I try to make sure that I can keep the rights to my piece. The first mainstream newspaper that I was published in was the San Francisco Guardian, and this was back in the 90s. And they gave me $100 for the piece, but I didn't know. I was like, I didn't know until out there is like that piece is not my piece no more. And that blew my mind. I was like, what? It's like, yeah, it's the Chronicle. It's not your piece. So with my writing, I make sure if I like for example, I wrote an article for the New York Times, for the ABA, and the contract is like 55 pages. It's like, wow, just for like a 500 word article. It's like, are you kidding me? But I try to read the article, make sure that I know what I'm getting into. So my thing is to know what you're getting into first. Ask the questions, is this gonna be your piece, my piece? Are you gonna pay me? Do I have control of the title? Because the not the Huffington Post, what's that big newspaper in New York? I forget the name. But anyway, they came and interviewed me, and they knew my politics, and they went back and they wrote the title. The title was atrocious. I was like, nobody's gonna read the article. The title is atrocious, But at that point, I didn't have no control, So you just make you decide, before you get into writing a piece for such a place. You read up things like, okay, what kind of rights do I have, and such and such. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think we have definitely gone over our time. So unless there are any last comments from our panelists, any last thoughts?
I'll contribute a last thought, if I may. And that is, I would just encourage every person with a disability to continue to create and continue to write. I'm inspired by everyone on this panel here, continually, because it motivates me to just continue writing and continue expressing. Oftentimes, the world won't really give a lot of feedback because they may not necessarily, have the same journey that we do. But I know the best compliment that I can ever receive is when somebody tells me, you know, you really showed me a different perspective that I'm not used to seeing. And I think that's probably what every writer wants to do. Too often times, disability is an afterthought in the non-disabled world. And if we're not going to speak up for our community, who is? And so we should continue to be unapologetic. We should continue to be strong in just expressing to everyone the joys, the lows, the highs, the frustrations, the funny situations we find ourselves in, all of it, because it's a part of diversity that needs to be expressed.
Thank you so much.
I'd also say just believe in yourself, and that sounds so cliche, but I feel like when I was starting out writing about disability, but in general, oftentimes I would talk myself out of pitching the outlets that I really wanted to get published in, and I just have a lot of anxiety about, oh, can I really do this? And when I'm forming stories, how can I think of ideas that really resonate with other disabled people and just audiences all over? And someone mentioned writer's block earlier, one of the questions. And I know for me, I try to remember, if I'm struggling with my writing, I try to remind myself, okay, what was it about this story or this project that excited me in the first place? What made me want to dive in? And I know oftentimes if I'm writing a really complicated story with a bunch of research and policy and a lot of good stuff, but it's hard to kind of figure out the core of the story. I think about myself, I'm a reader and a consumer of news and stories as well. And so what would I be drawn to when I pick this up? And so just in general, trusting yourself, knowing that you have what it takes to tell a great story, whether or not it's about disability, and you deserve to take up space in this world, and you're worthy.
Thank you so much. What a great comment to end with. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I'm so appreciative that you guys tuned in from different coasts and made the timing work. Thank you very, very much. We cannot wait to follow all of your work and read what you're writing. Thank you very, very much. Have a great evening. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.